London in 1886. Then the largest city in human history and the centre of the known world. With its self-importance, its dirt, its wealth and awful poverty, it seems a mystery to us now.
It was a different world, an entirely different world.
But there is a guide to this human jungle. Charles Booth, Victorian London's social explorer. Booth produced a series of pioneering maps that colour-coded the streets of his London according to the ever-shifting class of its residents. Booth's maps are like scans, X-rays that reveal to us the secret past beneath the skin of the present.
If people knew how many cattle was killed there, I don't think they'd live there.
He wanted his maps to chart stories of momentous social change.
I was on the bottom, and those houses were the lowest of the low.
The ebb and flow between enormous wealth and terrible poverty. How easily desirable or well-to-do neighbourhoods could descend into the haunts of the vicious and semi-criminal, and back again. Now the maps can help us reveal the changes that have shaped all our lives and made the story of the streets the story of us all.
Oh my goodness, the old toilet's gone.
So we're going back to one of the tens of thousands of streets that Booth mapped, to the East End, to a ring-shaped street called Arnold Circus.
Home, sweet home. Oh, goodness me. Wasn't as posh as this when I lived here. Oh, it really, and they made a good job of it.
Arnold Circus was designed to improve the lives of the poorest in the city. But little here went according to plan.
Born losers we are. Everything we touch turns to dross.
A mile north of the skyscrapers of the City of London. Just off Shoreditch High Street, which is experiencing a property boom based on art galleries and nightclubs. This is where you find Arnold Circus. For the people who live and work on this street, it's a haven, an inner city sanctuary.
It is a little bit of a secret. You wouldn't know it was here unless you made a detour.
This is the only place I know as a home, and I don't wish to move anywhere else.
When the Victorian social explorer Charles Booth surveyed Arnold Circus in 1898, it was newly built. He noted the 5-storey blocks of flats with shops underneath, including a neighbourhood grocer that still thrives. Booth also noted 2 schools on Arnold Circus. Only one is a school today. The headmistress remembers the first time she arrived here.
It's like walking into, I don't know, somewhere so different and I thought, I never knew this existed almost. It was like walking into a little, I don't know, oasis of something so different.
About 1,500 people live and work on Arnold Circus today, in this Victorian model village in the East End of the city. Booth classified Arnold Circus as pink, fairly comfortable. The blocks of flats provided modest homes for the key workers of the Victorian city. Just over 100 years later, more affluent residents are moving in, like Richard Wallace. He's created his ideal home here with his girlfriend Kate Beckett.
We've got the door where we come in, over here. We've got the living room on the left. Typically, we just sort of walk straight through, but we knocked out these walls here so you can see into the living room over there. If you walk through here, we've got the kitchen and bar area, and essentially the entire kitchen was moved. Typical putting in a kitchen, I guess, ripping it out, putting in a new kitchen. Original flatmate Tom named this the curry cupboard. The reason is if you open it, and you can smell it now, you can actually smell the cooking from the flat downstairs.
Some days it's more pungent than others, but it always puts me to shame.
In the flat below Richard and Kate live the Begums, a family of 9. The Begums don't own their flat, but are council tenants.
That's the entrance. Walk through here. This is the storage room. Through here. This is the living room. And that's the kitchen. And this is the girls' room, and that's my brother's room, and my other 2 sisters sleep in there.
So how many people sleep in these rooms?
3 and 4. I would like to have my own room as well. Then I would get my own time. I can do my homework quietly, stuff like that.
Arnold Circus today is both a sought-after place to live and an inner-city council estate. On this street, rich and poor live right alongside, or above and below each other. How this came to be can be traced through the history of Arnold Circus. But it's necessary to dig down deep into the past. The rubble beneath Arnold Circus is all that remains of what stood here before it was built. These graceful blocks and their gardens stand on the ruins of a slum, the direst poverty in Victorian London.
Slum is painting too bright a picture. I think it was, for the people like us, it would have been hell. It would have been absolute hell.
Alan Goffey's grandfather grew up in the 19th century Shoreditch slum, one of a family of 7 living in one room in a hovel right where this plane tree grows now. Over a century later, the lost slum beneath Arnold Circus can still be examined. Because Charles Booth not only mapped London after Arnold Circus was built, he first came here years before. His original 1889 map includes a description of the city's rotten core. This was in Shoreditch, where Arnold Circus is today. So using Booth's maps, it's possible to travel back in time to the streets buried beneath Arnold Circus. It was a maze of sunless alleys. Booth coloured them dark blue for chronic want, and black for the lowest class, vicious and semi-criminal.
Stop thief!
Dickens' Oliver Twist scared and thrilled Victorian London's respectable citizens. Booth set out to find the truth behind the poverty fiction. In 1889, when he first turned off Shoreditch High Street and into the slum, Booth was stepping into an unknown world. He discovered that streets once famed for silk weaving had become a densely populated warren. A single house here contained 60 people. There was barely any sanitation, and the streets were filled with human excrement, fostering deadly diseases. Life expectancy for the poorest of Victorian Shoreditch was just 16. Although there were 2 schools in the slum, a teacher admitted that school here is regarded as an interference. Booth interviewed some of the slum dwellers who lived where Arnold Circus is today. One family whose grim circumstances he recorded in his notebooks was the Goffeys.
And this is where my lot came from. But they weren't criminals. They were just 2 spending all their time keeping body and soul together.
Booth found the Goffeys in Half Nickel Street, which he would later mark dark blue for chronic want. On their doorstep, he noted, the body of a dead dog and nearby 2 dead cats, which lie as though they've slain each other. Booth described the Goffeys as one of 4 families living on the ground floor. Alan's great-grandfather was a cabinet maker, has a wife and 5 children, all young. These people are very poor.
I take pride in the fact that my family came from the nickel, but by golly, wouldn't want to have lived here. Because it was it must have been the absolute pits. I've got a birth certificate there, one of the kids born in Half Nickel Street, and 3 months later she's dead. They must have been bordering on starvation.
For many Victorians, the starvation of the slum was a symptom of a greater sickness, poverty itself. And by describing the deprivation here as chronic, the suggestion was that these people were incurable. Booth added his weight to a high-minded movement for social reform that believed the state must intervene to rid London of its slums.
Get up to bed.
In 1890, 2 years after Booth's visit to Shoreditch, the newly formed London County Council moved to compulsorily buy every hovel in the Shoreditch slum. It intended to demolish them all. In their place, the LCC would build its own homes. Unlike any private landlord, the ambition was not to build for profit, but to provide decent homes for the most miserable of London's poor. This would be Britain's first council estate.
This was a matter of tabula rasa, raising things to the ground and starting again. And in a way, that made it quite an exciting project at the time, and I think that was commented on. There was a sort of almost a glamour in terms of the simple scale of reconstruction.
Called the Boundary Scheme, work began in 1894, when almost 15 acres of the worst streets of Shoreditch were flattened. The streets were rearranged to radiate out from one circular street, named Arnold Circus, after an LCC official. The man behind the layout was the chief architect of the Boundary, Owen Fleming. He was just 23.
It's an incredibly exciting position to be put into. Not just him, but the group of people who are working with, put in a huge amount of energy and imagination into the designs.
Finn Williams lives just off Arnold Circus. Like Fleming, Finn works in a local authority planning office.
Owen Fleming himself is quite an idealist, and probably in some ways quite naive. He must be, because he's so young.
Fleming raised the interior of the circus, so its centre was hidden from people passing along the street, while giving the residents garden views from their windows.
Just the greenness and the visibility of the garden, which was very carefully planned, so that everyone would have a view, or as many people as possible would have a view of the gardens as possible, just in terms of visual amenity is what we call it now, as much as actually using it as a public space. So just something pleasant to look at, as well as something pleasant to use.
Surrounding the gardens are blocks of flats 5 stories high. There was no money for ornate plasterwork. The structure itself was used for decorative effect, as revealed in the original LCC plans.
What they were trying to do with these designs at the time is give a sense of a block that wasn't simply a regimented, replicated sort of barracks. They had details like the way that these gables come up, the way that the different windows sort of vary in sizes, the relationship of the doors, if you go down to the street level, are quite a small and domestic scale. So there are all ways of, I suppose, breaking down the sense of being in a municipal housing block.
Fleming wrote, "Blocks precisely the same, without any architectural feeling. The East Ender deserves better than that." Rising out of the ruins of an East End slum were buildings of a quality usually found in well-to-do West London, in Kensington or Chelsea. When Booth had first visited Shoreditch, the population here had been recorded at just over 5,000. On the new Boundary estate, there were 19 blocks containing just over 1,000 flats in all. there was the capacity to accommodate everyone who had lived in the slum. And the LCC was providing a home to them that was designed to change their lives.
Fleming was trying to engineer a new piece of community, a new society, by providing all of the things that he thought made up the perfect community. The shops, the local bakeries, the public space, the access to the churches, the fact there weren't any pubs there. They were all very carefully curated elements of an ideal form of community.
Arnold Circus opened its doors in 1896. For the Goffies of Half Nichols Street, a new dawn beckoned. But they didn't take up residence in Arnold Circus. Instead, they moved on to another miserable hovel nearby.
I know where our lot went, yeah. Curtain Road, which was where he moved to, which was the centre of the cabinet-making trade.
In Curtain Road, which never benefited from an LCC regeneration scheme, the Goffies continued their hopeless slum lives.
Born losers we are. Doomed to failure. Everything we touch turns to dross.
Perhaps the Goffies didn't move into Arnold Circus because they couldn't afford the rent here. Though intended for the poor, this development had only been part funded by London's ratepayers, so much of its cost was going to be recovered from the tenants. Rent on even a small flat here was over 10 shillings a week, 4 times the cost of a room in the slum, exorbitant for an unskilled labourer. The boundary had the capacity to house all the slum dwellers, but it was beyond the reach of the very poor. This LCC map marks with a black dot the final location of all the families made homeless when the slum was destroyed. It reveals how they circled around the boundary, but ultimately stayed in the miserable streets outside it. Not a single former slum dweller moved into Arnold Circus. The first council estate was built to improve the lives of the most miserable in the Victorian city, but the poorest didn't benefit at all. Instead, Shoreditch entered a new era.
There's a sense that a building is complete when it opens, which is ridiculous. It starts when it opens, and the rest of the life of the building is when it really gets used, and that sort of back and forth that gives a building its interest and its character as it changes and evolves.
The first tenants of the 2-bedroomed flat presently occupied by young professionals Richard Wallace and Kate Beckett were Celia and Simon Finkelstein. They were not from the slum. They'd come to the East End from Russia sometime in the 1870s, along with hundreds of thousands of Jews fleeing religious persecution in Eastern Europe. Simon Finkelstein had found work in the local industry that was even older than the slum, the garment trade. By 1896, Simon Finkelstein was doing well enough out of tailoring to afford to become one of Britain's first council tenants.
I could almost hear my mother calling me now. Because it's your birthday this week, and this is my present to you, to come back and say hello.
80-year-old Minnie Finkelstein is the granddaughter of Celia and Simon.
How do I get in?
When she was a child, Minnie and her parents lived in her grandparents' flat. She hasn't been back here for half a century.
The hundreds of times I used to climb these stairs, home from school, home from playing with my friends, used to come up these stairs and I had some wonderful, fond memories. This was my flat. Home, sweet home. Hello, Mum. Hello, Dad. Oh, goodness me. Wasn't as posh as this when I lived here. But it was our home, and this is our front room. This was our front room here. And my bedroom was here. My bedroom was just there. Oh, it really, and they made a good job of it. Gosh, we hadn't had this. This is luxury.
Just off the kitchen, in what is now a storeroom, was a cubbyhole that contained the flat's sole source of running water, cold only.
Oh my goodness me, look at this.
None of the flats on Arnold Circus were built with baths or showers. But the Finkelsteins were one of the few families here to have a toilet in their flat.
God, look at this, it's phenomenal. And down there they used to bring the milk in at 4 in the morning in big silver churns. Thomas, his name was Thomas, Mr. Thomas. And he had a dairy down there, that last one. But I do remember the milk churns, they used to fascinate me. 4 in the morning used to come. We don't do that sort of thing now, do we? We go to Tesco's.
The milkman and the coalman and the rag and bone man were much more than local tradespeople. They were the characters who gave the street a human face. They've now almost entirely vanished from the city's doorsteps. In 1898, Charles Booth returned to Shoreditch. He redrew his map to incorporate the new street plan. He described the people on these now fairly comfortable streets as artisan class. Census returns reveal that nearly all the boundary's first tenants were skilled tradesmen. Many worked in the garment trade. Tailoring is now kept alive on Arnold Circus by Jenny Schwartz.
I've been introduced to people before, and when they actually found out where I lived, they're like, I've seen your lights on all night long before.
Though a recent arrival on Arnold Circus, Jenny feels a personal bond to the street's past.
I like being here because it's just so much history here. It's always been in my family, tailoring, and it's just something I grew up with. My great-grandfather was a bespoke tailor. He had his own shop, and my nan's a tailor, my aunt is a tailor. So it kind of runs in a family, and I think that's where it comes from. Especially around here, when you go out like early in the morning and nobody's around, it kind of feels like you're stepping back in time. I like the feel of tradition and how it used to be. Like when you think about 100 years ago, even a tramp on the street was wearing a suit. People were dressed differently, especially men spend a lot more time and money on their appearance. So for me this is really interesting, and especially around here, which used to be a very poor area, that people still dressed up.
At the turn of the 20th century, Britain's first council estate built a proud community in this once unhappy corner of the East End. The people here were hard-working and well turned out. According to Booth, poor but respectable. In its first years, proper behaviour was strictly enforced on Arnold Circus. There was an estate superintendent, the formidable Henry Webb, with the power to evict tenants for breaking any of his rules, among which were: the stairs and landings shall be swept daily and washed every Saturday by the tenants in turn. No clothes or unsightly objects shall be exposed to public view. Tenants are requested to clean their windows at least once a week.
Sounds a bit kind of like a dictatorship there, when things now are completely different.
Mushtaq Osmani has been the housing officer on Arnold Circus for the last 2 years.
We've got caretakers that are expected to sweep up. In terms of rent payments, there's a lot more flexibility now. An eviction is usually last resort. We're trying to support the residents as much as we can.
But some things haven't changed.
There's no lifts in Boundary Estate. I'm constantly going up and down the stairwells. For some reason, I usually end up on the 4th floor, where all my problems lie.
Henry Webb climbed these stairs till it killed him. literally. He died doing the job here on the boundary. But Webb left an important legacy. He helped establish the council estate as respectable.
I remember my mother having to go at my father once because he didn't do the stairs. And we have to do them. There was a notice on the board, it isn't here now. There was to be in Hebrew as well, in Hebrew and English, about looking after tenancy, yeah, on the board. So there was conformity, yeah. But we had that respect.
The Finkelsteins flourished on Arnold Circus. Minnie's parents took over her grandparents' council flat. Her father, Harry, worked nearby as a shoesmith. He also spoke prayers for the dead at his local synagogue. On Arnold Circus, the Finkelsteins climbed the social ladder without losing touch with their Jewishness. In 1900, one of Booth's researchers took social mapping in a new direction. He mapped the Jewish population in East London. Brick Lane, the centre of the garment industry, was blue, over 95% Jewish. Half a mile to the north is Arnold Circus. Here, the blocks were individually mapped. One is dotted blue, over 75% Jewish. This is where the Finkelsteins lived.
Tiny Grand Palais kept a permanent Yiddish company. Yiddish was the accepted language in Whitechapel. Street adverts, notices on pillar boxes and fire plugs were written in Yiddish.
Jewish immigrants often found themselves welcomed in the East End. But in the 1937 local election, the anti-Semitic black shirts won 8,000 votes in the ward surrounding the Boundary estate. Arnold Circus, designed to exist as a world apart from the streets around it, became a sanctuary for the East End Jews.
We all knew each other, and we were all one people. It was like living on an island, a precious island.
In the centre of Arnold Circus was an open space where everyone rubbed along, whether Jews or Gentiles like Joan Rose. She grew up here before the Second World War.
Didn't acknowledge it. You knew by the names that were Jewish. Didn't mean anything to you. It wasn't important. The spaces between each block of flats were called playgrounds. They were named by the children. Coming to our playground, I'm coming to your playground. You draw a chalk line, play tennis. The boys would put 3 white marks, play cricket. Very, very friendly, very social. If a child was crying, you can bet your life somebody would look out of the window and say, "Why are you crying, darling? Come here." They would help you. Very caring community.
Joan Rose's family ran the estate Greengrocers and lived 1 floor below the Finkelsteins, in the flat presently occupied by the Begum family.
Blackbird, blackbird. Very cosy, very cosy. Used to love to come up here.
Joan now lives in Surrey. Her family moved out of this flat when she was a teenager.
Sitting here, I know that technology and anything in life moves on, but I'm sorry that is not still the butchers. I'm sorry that's not still the delicatessen. I'm sorry that's not still the rent office. I'm sorry that's not still the doctors. And I'm sorry that's not still Kozov's the bakers. And I wish somebody had a photo of it, as was. Because I can actually see the families, and that has come back to me. Just sitting here, I thought, oh, yes, I remember Nita Brodie, used to be friendly with the girls that lived there. I remember Dr. Murphy's son used to come and buy tomatoes nearly every morning, and I used to think, That's a lot of tomatoes. And now when I think back, I think he liked me and he wanted to come over and see me. That's being a bit vain, I know, but you don't eat that amount of tomatoes, do you? So, no, a good memory, a memory that makes you smile, yeah.
Like the Finkelsteins, Joan's family had been in Arnold Circus since the beginning, when her grandparents, Alfred and Phoebe Raymond, took the lease on their grocery downstairs. Joan remembers the shop in its 1930s heyday.
They had fruit and veg all the way along there, and that little corner here, we used to call it the office. And it's amazing because when you're a child, things look bigger. And that's where all the paperwork was done for the shop.
The Raymond's grocery was one of a parade of neighbourhood shops on an avenue running off Arnold Circus. This was the bustling high street of the council estate.
I'm just going to have a look and see if it's still there. There's a fireplace somewhere. And I'm sure it must be still there. And here was the kitchen. And it is! And in front of the fireplace was one gas ring. You had to eat during the day because this shop was open, you remember, 7 days a week.
Originally, as well as the open all hours high street, there were 2 schools serving the community on Arnold Circus. These were the only buildings to survive the demolition of the slum. One of them is Virginia Primary.
Hello.
Come in.
Thank you. Oh my God, it's changed. This was one of my old classrooms. It's lost a lot of character, although I still they have the old radiators. No, I remember when they were installed. It was cold before that. It was cold before that. But we used to have gaslight here.
Aubrey Goldsmith grew up on Arnold Circus and started at Virginia School when he was 6 in 1933.
And then it's playtime, but just sit.
Ah, yeah. The classes were shared, boys and girls together. 45 was the average class. I had close friends that were Jewish and Christian. It didn't make any difference. We never heard of any... We weren't brought up with it. We heard that it went on elsewhere, but here it was non-sectarian. There was no problems. Teacher was Sir or Miss. Always, Sir or Miss, and that was it. We learned all the time, and the standards were high. Disruption just wouldn't be tolerated. If there was anybody disrupting, the teacher had the capability of soon putting them to rights. There was the old-fashioned walking stick cane, and you would get six of the best if you misbehaved. It hurt, and it left marks on your buttocks, because most of us never wore underpants.
Aubrey's education introduced him to the world beyond Arnold Circus. School trips took him out of the East End.
We went to places like the Isle of Wight, to Great Yarmouth, and we were taken on educational tours. We went to places like Smith's Crisp Factory, Coleman's Mustard Factory. We went to historic places, and the whole thing was controlled.
The curriculum encouraged the children of the first council estate to adopt the values of respectable citizens.
What started here helped you in your life. The basis of it all was here. I think we learned humanity. We knew about wrong and right. We learned to be responsible.
But in 1939, Albury's education suddenly changed course. During the Second World War, the schools closed on Arnold Circus, and the children were evacuated to safety.
With the war, when we were evacuated, it opened up another world. For example, my own I was evacuated to Cornwall. They were very kind to us. A lot of the Jewish kids, for the first time in their lives, ate ham and things that they'd never eaten before. It opened our eyes to a life outside of a council estate. Remember that whatever this was, the oasis that it was still a council estate. And you realise that there were other ways of living.
German bombing raids damaged over 20,000 houses in Bethnal Green. But Arnold Circus survived unscathed. And by 1945, most of the children had returned. The shops, many of which had closed for the duration, opened up again. Post-war Arnold Circus appeared to be picking up where it had left off. Sue Stockwell moved into Arnold Circus in 1957.
Like moving to another country. I only moved from North Road to here. It was like moving to another world. No, I loved it round here. I liked all the cultures and I liked the Jewish food. It was lovely. I used to come out my door, you could smell the donuts and the bread cooking. It was just like living with a big family. Everyone knew one another in the shops. Over here used to be Jack. He was a Jewish man who used to have a sweet shop. All the children used to buy his penny lollies at them old, them old-fashioned freezers. It was like really solid blocks of ice with no taste in them, but they was nice in the 50s.
The shovel we dug down deep, I'm looking for dollars, so we all had a peep. It's the name of Science, we dug a big hole.
You never went off your estate, you played here all the time. All this along here, this was all we used to play all the time, and this used to be our favourite road. You could go up and down here with your skates on, because it was smooth. Everyone knew one another. It was nice because you come down, the park used to be full of the Jewish women. I used to know them all, and it was all like, hello, bubbler, hello, like, used to have a laugh. And they had such a funny sense of humour, the Cockney Jew, that they was like being entertained every day on the street corner, because they just used to make you laugh, all of them.
The success of Arnold Circus in creating a respectable community where slums once stood became a role model. Across Britain, slums were cleared. By the mid-50s, 3 million new council homes had been built. Becoming a council tenant was celebrated as a step towards a better life.
Poplar's new Lansbury neighbourhood, which will be a complete little town when ready, welcomes the first tenant, Mr. Albert Snoddy, to its first completed block of flats.
Council homes built after the war came with all the mod cons. Hot running water was standard. The flats in Arnold Circus, with their single taps of cold only, now felt old-fashioned. The elderly residents here, who had never known anything else, accepted the basic amenities of Arnold Circus. But to the new generation, the promise of a more comfortable life elsewhere proved irresistible.
Their sons got married, the sons moved out, then the parents got older, either one died and the other one lived, and eventually they all just moved away.
Gone to Stamford Hill, Golders Green, Cricklewood. With a strong hand, soon the last remnant will go. And since its former patrons have moved away, the Grand Palais puts on the odd Yiddish play only occasionally.
Between 1931 and 1961, the population of Bethnal Green halved. On Arnold Circus, for the first time in its history, flats stood empty. What breathed life back into Arnold Circus was a radical movement that set out to challenge the basis of property ownership in London. The man who brought this revolution in housing to Arnold Circus was Terry Fitzpatrick.
I'd say my politics are left libertarian. I believe in a small state. I believe in people doing as much as they can for themselves. I'm homeless. Well, there's a flat over there. It's been empty for 2 years. Go and move into it.
Terry was one of about 30,000 squatters in 70s London. In the East End, around Arnold Circus, many were in the properties of the largest landlord in the city, the Greater London Council, which had recently superseded the LCC.
There had to be a confrontation because they were the dispensers of council property, and they were bad managers. They didn't look after it. In '74, there were 3,200 people on the waiting list, and there were sufficient empty properties in Tower Hamlets to clear it overnight.
Here, in the birthplace of council housing, Terry's confrontation with the GLC would have a profound impact. In the early 20th century, the council flats on Arnold Circus had provided a haven for the East End Jews. Here they felt safe from anti-Semitism. By the 1970s, in nearby Brick Lane, a new immigrant community was settling in.
It was a nice atmosphere here. Everyone knew everyone. This restaurant was one of the oldest, and it used to be a cafe in the 70s. Remember the jukeboxes? We used to just come in here, have tea or coffee and listen to the jukebox. Music was mostly Indian film music.
Rahim Baksh came to Brick Lane in 1971. He featured in a documentary about the East End he had just discovered. Rahim's family was one of thousands that emigrated from Bangladesh to Britain in the 60s and 70s. Many settled in the East End, drawn here by work in the garment trade.
In Bangladesh, Brick Lane is known to many people because when people go back for a visit, often they talk about Brick Lane. So there are people who have heard of Brick Lane.
By the mid-70s, Brick Lane's Jewish garment companies were becoming Bangladeshi-owned. There were Bangladeshi shops. But the one thing the Asian EastEnders didn't have was decent housing.
আমি আমার পরিবার আমরা পাঁচটা বাচ্চা লইয়া ইয়া বস্তু দিছি আর আর 5 বছর ধরে আমি ওয়েটিং লিস্ট কাউন্সিলর ফলাটন লাগি আজ পর্যন্ত পাইছি না গো আমি পাইছি না আমার কার্ড আছে ওয়েটিং লিস্টের।
About 500 Bangladeshi families were crammed into a few privately rented rooms around Brick Lane, living in squalor which echoed the 19th century slums. That was when Terry Fitzpatrick first met Bangladeshis.
I found them very combative in terms of they would act collectively. You could explain to them, you're not going to fight the council on your own. And they understood that instinctively.
We try to mobilize people from this area to pay our deepest solidarity with the brothers in Hackney, right?
The meeting between Terry the squatter and the homeless Bangladeshis was about to change the face of Arnold Circus.
Move the stuff in.
What about the police?
No, they can't touch you. Move fast.
This TV drama, King of the Ghetto, tells the story of a local builder who organises Bangladeshi squats in the East End. The angry and reckless hero is based on Terry Fitzpatrick.
There was no plan. One thing just led to another. We'd help a homeless family. They've got some relations. Can we find them a flat? There was never any shortage of a Bangladeshi prepared to squat. Once the thing got rolling, once there was a momentum to it, you could have squatted 10, 20, 30 families a day.
King of the Ghetto tells how Terry organised an unprecedented mass squat with hundreds of Bangladeshis.
Okay, I'll be back in a minute. I want a list of every family in which flat they're in, all right?
Amazingly, this wasn't all dramatic invention. Around the corner from Arnold Circus in 1976, another Victorian block that the GLC had abandoned was occupied by Terry and 300 Bangladeshis. One of those alongside Terry 40 years ago was Rahim Baksh.
Haji Sahab, bala suni.
Oh, Balasi, how are you? It's been a long time. You okay?
I met Rahim in the summer of '76. We just moved the first families in. And Rahim said, well, this isn't very nice, particularly where I'm living. Any flats down there? And there was a one-bedroom flat on the ground floor, and he moved in.
At first, I was a bit surprised because I never heard of anything like that, that you could just move into like squatting places. And I thought probably it's not legal, etc.
In 1977, the squat's position became precarious. The Tories won the GLC election, vowing to sort out council housing in London.
We're bang on target for victory.
Matters would soon come to a head.
George Tremlett is an unusual Conservative councillor, a man who knows...
George Tremlett, a young, ambitious Tory, was put in charge of the GLC housing policy and became the scourge of the squatters. He soon heard about the occupation near Arnold Circus.
I went straight down, and there were these 60 families of all ages and lots of children, ragged, clearly very, very poor. They didn't have windows or doors, they were just hanging curtains over the apertures and so on. I mean, it was Dickensian, worse than Dickensian. Under normal GLC policy as it was, we would have gone to court, got an eviction and thrown them out.
But George Tremlett had other plans for the mass squat.
Do you want to fight 60 homeless families who are living in poverty? I mean, for what? Is that what life's about? I mean, you know, I didn't take on the GLC housing job to do something like that.
Instead of evicting the squatters, George made a complete U-turn in housing policy. He offered to find council flats for every Bangladeshi in the squat.
George Tremlett said he admired squatters because we were entrepreneurial. We didn't wait to sit around to be housed. We went out and did it for ourselves.
The squatters were even offered a choice of where they might want to live.
They said, just draw up a list of estates wherever you want, wherever you feel safe, and we'll offer you accommodation on them. And we were absolutely gobsmacked because they just completely capitulated to everything that we'd been demanding.
The Bangladeshis drew a map to identify the area of the East End where they wanted to live. Arnold Circus was on this map.
I remember seeing a map. I remember a long discussion about the history of the Jews in the area around here and how they'd been assimilated. We sort of talked about, well, if it worked a couple of generations ago, it could work again.
Within weeks, 60 Bangladeshi families were allocated flats in Arnold Circus and the other council estates they selected.
Everyone was rehoused. The whole building was cleared. And I mean, I had a 7.5-ton lorry, and we were up and down here every other day moving families in.
For the first time in his life, Rahim Baksh had somewhere he could legally call his own home. He still lives in Arnold Circus today.
When you have your own flat to live in, it's like it's your home, isn't it? I mean, now you're a tenant and you just live there as long as you can.
Rahim's story was just the beginning. George Tremlett had set a precedent. Giving Bangladeshis flats in selected streets, including Arnold Circus, became GLC policy.
With GLC officials. The question that's
but some newspapers accused the GLC of building ghettos.
affecting all people in the area.
I was appalled. I was appalled because that had not been in our minds at all. We had to get it. And what I was trying to do was to unwind it and enable the Bengali families in the area to feel at ease within the community. I didn't see it as ghettos at all.
Housing officers who were opposed to this wanted dispersal. They had leaked the plan to a journalist, and that was the first time the word ghetto was used. We'd never demanded that. All the demands had been were that people lived in safe areas.
It was just, we just demanded safer places where there were other Bengalis living, and I never thought of being in a ghetto or anything.
The ghetto headlines inflamed racial tensions. On the streets around Arnold Circus, violence erupted.
3 or 4 of them punched me, one after another.
These shops were broken by bottles, and they run all the way up here, and here, at this point, give them a lot of opposition.
The violence was an attempt to make the GLC reverse its housing policy. But nobody could stop the population change happening in the East End, as was made crystal clear by the head of the GLC, Horace Cutler.
They'll be occupying a building, or perhaps 2 or 3 buildings. They'll be together. The language problem is got over. Their habits, their customs will be acceptable within their own community. And I can't see any reason why this piece of, I almost call it social engineering, but it isn't that because it's not deliberate. It's a unique problem.
What will happen to the existing families who are already living in these tenement blocks?
Well, they have a choice. Either they can stay there and live with them, with the Bengalis, or they can go.
The GLC commitment to provide sanctuary for the Bangladeshis utterly changed Arnold Circus within a generation. This map was drawn in the 1990s by Tower Hamlets Council, which has now taken over the management of Arnold Circus from the GLC. The map reveals the ethnicity of the borough 15 years ago. Some streets, those in black, were over 70% Bangladeshi. Arnold Circus was about 40%. A summer evening in 2011. It's Ramadan. Rushna Begum is preparing a ceremonial feast that will begin at sunset.
So we eating, then we praying whole night, then come back again and eat all stuff.
Because it's a Sunday, Rushna's extended family has been invited to eat with her. Most live nearby.
Yeah, this is my mom. She's my oldest sister. He's my nephew. His Baba. His name is Abu. The older sister.
Weekends is always full of packed full of family around here. In this house and the other house, my grand's house, we're always gathering together. So we see a lot of each other.
For 20 years now, a thriving Bangladeshi community has found sanctuary on Arnold Circus. But this has always been a street of change. Just as the slum dwellers and the Jews did before them, Bangladeshis are now moving on. Today, only about 20% of the households here are Bangladeshi. Behind this latest movement is a complete rethink of the role of council housing in Britain. A social revolution that began 30 years ago.
It was Anthony Eden who chose for us the goal of a property-owning democracy. But for all the time that I've been in public affairs, That has been beyond the reach of so many who were denied the right to the most basic ownership of all, the homes in which they live.
In 1980, a law was passed giving council tenants the right to buy their homes at a discount. Two pioneers of this legislation were the GLC's Horace Cutler and George Tremlett.
There are 5 or 6 million council house tenants in this country, right? Some of them will want to buy their own homes. We are making it possible for them to do so.
We're going to keep the rates down, and we're going to use the money to invest in the future of London. It's very important, this investment, you know.
If you're a GLC tenant, you'll soon be receiving this free booklet. It tells you all about buying a home of your own.
In 1980, 40% of Britons lived in council homes. Now, just 12% do. On Arnold Circus, almost half the flats are now privately owned. The parade of local stores has become one of the most fashionable shopping streets in London.
It's good to see that the shops are now occupied and they're not empty. It's a sadness to me that more thought hasn't gone into making those shops things that might be more relevant to the local people as well.
Arnold Circus even has an art gallery in what used to be one of its schools.
I mean, this goes off for 15,000.
Across the circus, Virginia is still a school. About 70% of its pupils are Bangladeshi. The Begums could not afford to buy their flat. But the flat above them was bought and later sold for over £250,000. It's now home to Richard Wallace and Kate Beckett.
Which one's mine? This one. I like the fact that it's real people who live around here. I don't particularly care if it's a council building or not.
But to be honest, if you look at it from the outside, it's got character, I don't know if it's Victorian or whatever it is, but it's something nice. It looks like something where you could be sort of, maybe not proud, but happy to own it, think this is a good place to live.
The Victorian elegance of Arnold Circus is the result of an extraordinary dream, that urban planning could change people's lives. Built for the very poor, it has been a haven for Jews, then Bangladeshis. It's becoming a new kind of sanctuary today, from the restless fury of modern city living. To discover more about Britain's secret streets, the Open University has produced a free guidebook. Go to bbc.co.uk/ourstreets and follow the links to the Open University, or call 0845 366 0251.